Thank you very much for those kind words, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to this. It's a pleasure to be back in Norway. I haven't been here for quite some time, so the old currency I'm carrying is well out of date by now. Now, I should start by confessing to this audience that I'm not really an Air Force man. I'm more of a Navy man. And I see there are one or two Navy people here by the uniforms. But I do have one thing in common with the Air Force, which is that I like to look at things from an extremely high altitude. And that's what you're going to get today. From the opening remarks, I rather feel like I belong to yesterday. And perhaps looking at me, you'll see that that's quite appropriate too. Because I'm going to give you, I'm not going to say anything about air power, because I don't know much about air power. What I'm going to give you is an overview of what I think the emerging global order looks like and what the characteristics of its security agendas are going to be. And the argument I want to make is that this global order is really rather different from anything we've ever seen before, and that we're not thinking hard enough about that. So I'm going to be in disagreement with some of the other speakers. I think I will be disagreeing with Dr. Trennan later on, who conceptualized the emerging world order as multipolar, right? Like kind of going back to the 19th century. I just don't think that's where we're going, and if we use those kinds of concepts, we will not understand the world we're moving into. If you want a catchphrase for this world, I call it structure deep pluralism. And this has a number of fairly straightforward characteristics. The first is that by pluralism, I mean that lots of things are much more diffuse than we are used to their being. Wealth is much more diffuse than it has been. Power is diffusing very widely. And perhaps more importantly, cultural authority is diffusing very widely. We are at the end of the Western era. We've got used to a kind of liberal teleology in which the assumption is everybody will eventually end up being like the West. It's not going to happen. You can see it not happening right in front of you now. Spend 5 minutes in China and you will see this is not where the world is going. This will also be a world in which there are no superpowers. We can see the United States deconstructing itself as a superpower very quickly. We can also see that the whole idea of there being a hegemonic power that, in a sense, manages the system, or even a group of hegemonic powers to manage the system, that idea is becoming illegitimate. Right? The rest of the world, the global south, whatever you want to call it, remembers colonialism, they remember racism, they resent it. That still plays a big part in their view of the world and how they behave in it. And they are now getting rich and powerful and having more confidence in their own cultures. So this is going to be a world with diffuse power, wealth, and cultural authority, with no superpowers, with no global hegemon, and no legitimacy for that role. It's going to be, therefore, a world of great powers. And I'm going to look in a bit more detail at these great powers. But the general thing I have to say about them is that these great powers are all in varying degrees autistic, by which I mean they are inward-looking and their behavior is more self-referential. Their behavior is more generated by their internal dynamics than by any kind of rational interaction or calculated, knowledgeable interaction with their external environment. And this is, I think, going to be a problem for global management. This is a new world because the only global order we have ever known has been a Western global order. There were kinds of international order before that, but never on a global scale. It was the West that first made the world by discovering the oceanic routes and tying everything together. This small group of countries, therefore, has had a disproportionate influence over the last couple of centuries, and it's now conspicuously pulling back from that role, partly because it no longer has the power and wealth to play that role, and partly because, as we see with Brexit in my country and Trump in the US, the electorates in the leading countries no longer want their countries to play that role. The existing powers, if you like, are a bit worn out. So the situation we're moving into, this deep pluralism, has a novel structure, something that we've never really seen before in world history. On the one hand, there's a very tight interdependence, not just economically, but also in relation to all kinds of other issues like the environment and disease, that the world is highly interdependent in ways that it hasn't really been before, and that interdependence is intensifying. So that's a kind of expansion of the situation we've been in for the last couple of centuries. But it's going to combine now with a distribution of power and cultural authority and wealth that looks more like ancient and classical times, when there were several centers of civilization. But in ancient and classical times, those centers of civilization were only very lightly connected to each other. So we have this odd combination. We're not going back to the future, as it were, but we're certainly not staying in the rather odd historical situation that we've been in for the last couple of centuries, where a very small group of powers has dominated the whole planet. We are returning, in that sense, to a more natural order of things. Now, let me now look at the great powers that will occupy the system. And here, I want to make a distinction, which is not very often made in discussions of international relations, but which I think should be, a distinction between great powers and superpowers. Right? For superpowers, the world is their region. So the United States was, and just about still is, a superpower. Great powers are not ones for which the world is their region. They are great because they impinge on more than one region, like China and like Russia and like the EU. But they don't have the world as their region. And we are rapidly moving away from a situation in which we have any superpowers at all. Right? Once upon a time, we had three, briefly, right after the Second World War. Then when Britain, its bankruptcy and its small size were exposed, we were down to two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And then with the implosion of the Soviet Union, we were down to one. And you can see where this trend is going. And Trump is doing his very best to burn up whatever remaining social capital the United States still has. So we're heading towards zero. Right? A world with no superpowers. And we need to get used to this idea, because all of us, even me, have grown up in a world in which superpowers were taken for granted. And we're now going to have to get used to a world in which there are none, and therefore a world that is in some senses a little bit more like the 19th century, when a collection of great powers had to talk amongst themselves to try and tease out some form of international order. Now, as I said, the problem is the great powers that we're going to have are all going to be inward-looking, and I'd like to explain a little bit about why that is. Let me look first at the old great powers. The United States, the European Union. I count the European Union as a great power. It's not fashionable to do that, but I think it is. And then at Japan and Russia. It seems to me that this group of great powers have all now become fairly inward-looking for somewhat different reasons, but in none of them does the great will exist to manage the world or even to want to take over the world. The United States and Europe share a number of things in common. They are in relative decline, relative, not absolute decline, in terms of their material capability. That's not controversial. What seems to be a relatively new development is the very sharp weakening of domestic support for both the liberal project generally and for great power, leadership, and responsibility. All of these countries are electing leaders who say, look after us, right? America first. Or in Britain's case, I'm not quite sure what the slogan should be, but Britain by itself in some lunatic fashion. So there's a weakening legitimacy at home to take on leadership roles, and there's also a weakening legitimacy abroad for such roles. The Chinese and the Indians and the Russians and others do not like Western leadership and do not recognize it as being legitimate, and do not recognize the liberal teleology, the idea that the whole world should end up looking like the United States, do not recognize that as where the world is going. There are some differences between Europe and the US. I mean, Europe, it hardly needs to be said, has a great deal of difficulty trying to pull together any kind of common foreign and security policy at all. It is almost by definition mainly a player in and around its own region, and it is, of course, deeply preoccupied with its internal construction. So it's still very much a work in progress, or perhaps not even progress at the moment, but a work at any rate. It's under construction with perhaps some problems and delays in that construction. So it doesn't have much capacity or energy for managing anything other than itself, and up to a limited point its own region. The United States is still a bit torn on this. The United States has a foreign policy establishment and a military establishment that is deeply imbued with the idea that it should be running the world, and therefore the United States is going to have a really big psychological adjustment problem to this new world order. And so far, it's not handling it particularly well. The United States has to get used to the idea that it's no longer going to be the sole superpower, that is going to be almost certainly for a considerable time the greatest of the great powers, so kind of primus inter pares, but it's not adjusting well to the idea that it's no longer running the world. So far, and this precedes Trump, who almost by definition is going to handle this badly because he doesn't care about any of it. But the United States has not responded all that well to initiatives like the Chinese Asia Infrastructure Development Investment Bank and the need to rejig the balance of influence and power within the IMF to take account of China and other rising powers. The Americans are going to hang on as long as they can, just as Britain is still hanging on to, and France indeed are hanging on to their UN Security Council seats, even though they have long since lost really any right to claim that. Those are kind of ancient historical things. So if we look then at the other two of the traditional great powers, Japan and Russia, these are both in relative and in some ways absolute demographic decline. And we are in an era when demographics are back, right? For a long time, and there's no better example of it than my country, for a long time power was not associated with population. So Britain could run nearly a quarter of the world with a relatively tiny population. That's, with the diffusion of wealth and power, that's disappearing, and it's big countries with big populations that are going to be the big powers. And Japan and Russia are both doing badly in the demographic department. Both of them, I think, are better thought of now as regional powers than as great powers. Japan is in a rather awkward position. It had a very good Cold War. It had a beautiful position of kind of insulation where the balance, it was like a Lagrange point, where the balance of forces around it kept it relatively safe. Now Japan is very exposed, but Japan is still a big enough power, and this is often not appreciated enough, I think. It's a big enough power that it makes a difference which side Japan is on, whether it swings towards China or whether it stays in alignment with the United States, as seems the more likely option. But Japan has crucial choices, and which way Japan goes, whether with China, with the United States, or off by itself will make a big difference to the kind of world that we're in. Russia, it seems to me, is weakening because amongst all of the great powers, it is the least good at understanding capitalism, it seems to me. Therefore, Russia is declining in terms of wealth and power because it doesn't really get capitalism. The Chinese get capitalism. It's a different version from ours, but look at the difference between China and Russia, and you will see what I mean. So Russia, I think, is more of a regional than a great power. It is still a great power in some senses. Obviously, it's got nuclear weapons, and if you're sitting here in Norway, it certainly looks like a great power because it's your neighbor. Okay? And if you're one of Russia's neighbors, then you have quite a bit to worry about, it seems to me. So globally, I think Russia has, let me be slightly insulting, it has a lot of nuisance power, but it's not a great power in the sense of representing an idea or anything that is going to influence the world in a very big way. But it will be quite aggressive in defending and possibly re-extending its sphere. And its partnership with China is very interesting. And it seems to me an extremely big question as to whether, how you interpret this is a bit up for grabs. Is the China-Russia partnership going to be stable? It's looking pretty stable so far, but historically these are not countries that have been traditional friends by any stretch whatsoever. They do have a shared anti-Westernism, anti-Americanism, but as the US itself declines as a superpower, that glue will weaken. So I think one of the big strategic things to watch is the China-Russia partnership and whether that stays firm or begins to unravel. If we look now at in a sense, the new great powers, and here I'm just going to look at China and India. I mean, Brazil is a possible candidate here, but a bit further down the line, I think. China and India are both big. They are both civilizational powers. They are both very autistic. If you want to read up on this, there's a book by the American strategist Edward Luttbach that looks at China as an autistic power. He simply associates autism with size. And since China is far bigger than anything else, he argues it's the most autistic. And there's something in that argument. More interesting, I think, is that these two countries are both developing countries. They still classify themselves as developing countries, and they have that status within the UN system. And it means a lot to them, and they are not going to let that go. And this is an unusual combination. Great power, developing country. Great powers might be thought of as having responsibilities for managing the global system. Developing countries, in general, are thought of as having their main responsibility to develop themselves. And if you look at the rhetoric coming out of China and India, you see a great deal of that. Our first responsibility is to develop ourselves. That will be our contribution to the world. And there's something in that argument. It's not a completely hypocritical argument. But it does mean that these countries are not keen to pick up global management responsibilities because they still have big development responsibilities of their own. This means they are somewhat inward-looking. Culturally, both of them are relatively self-contained. I mean, if you think of the difference between China and the United States, the Americans, I'm simplifying here, but the Americans basically think everybody should end up being American or looking like America because that's the right way to go and that's the right thing to do. So Americanism, if you will, is a universalist outlook. It assumes the whole world will eventually come to look like the United States. The catchphrase that you find most commonly in China is Chinese characteristics. Right? Everything is with Chinese characteristics, which basically says, we do things our own way, you can't be like us, we don't expect you to be like us, we don't want you to be like us. We've made our language very difficult to learn precisely to keep you out. So the Chinese culture isn't intrinsically universalist in the same way that American culture has been. And India also has something of those characteristics, that Hinduism is in some ways a geographically bounded idea. China, of course, we need to watch carefully because it's number 2 in the world and it's rapidly catching up. And China has a number of very distinctive characteristics. I don't think China is the big problem for you people here because it's a long way away, and basically China isn't too concerned about Europe. But I'll just say a few things about things to look at when you're thinking about China. One is the arrogance of power. Senator Fulbright of the United States once wrote a book a long time ago called The Arrogance of Power, talking about the United States. Somebody needs to write that book now for China, because there is a clear arrogance of power playing in China, which may lead them to overextend themselves, push themselves a bit further than they should really go. And that, I think, is a legitimate concern. Chinese culture contains a number of characteristics that are different from those in Western culture. It's a much more intrinsically hierarchical culture, and therefore both its domestic and its foreign relations reflect that. And it's very concerned with face and the loss of face. That drives Chinese policy in very interesting and different ways. And if you're looking at China, you need to understand those dynamics in order to get behind its behavior and understand what's going on. Perhaps the key thing you need to know about China is that the Communist Party is endlessly paranoid about its own legitimacy and power. It spends more on domestic security than it does on national defense, and even the PLA isn't about national defense. The remit of the PLA is to defend the party. Right? It's the party's army, and has been ever since the beginning. And you need to understand that as well if you want to understand China's behavior. Now, let me then turn, because I'm beginning to run out of time, to the security characteristics, the security agenda of this emerging world, if you will. And I think it divides into 3 types of security agenda. There's a traditional security agenda, which is the one that you people are in business to handle, which is mainly about traditional kinds of military political rivalry. It seems to me this is going to be, in this new world order, this is going to be a relatively limited agenda. It's going to have strong local manifestations, but there's not going to be a central global rivalry for who controls the world like there was during the Cold War, because if you follow my arguments up to this point, nobody wants to control the world. Right? Everybody wants to get on with their own thing and doesn't want to be taking responsibility for running the world. That said, I think there are going to be a number of identifiable aspects to this, which will be ongoing. One is that there'll be a rivalry amongst the space powers to dominate the high frontier. Related to that, and which we see now on a day-to-day basis with the decisions about intermediate range missiles and the treaties concerning them, that there's going to be an ongoing struggle to maintain deterrence. Right? That's been in the background for quite some time, and that seems likely to come into the foreground now. And thirdly, there will be regional rivalries, and you, of course, are sitting right next door to one of those. This is partly to do with spheres of influence and boundaries. The main points of interest here, I think, will be Russia versus NATO, as has already been mentioned, and that's something that expands right across the frontier, all the way up from the North Cape down to Turkey. And the other one will be basically in the Asia-Pacific, or the Indo-Pacific, as it's now trendy to call it. This will be partly about a US-China rivalry for influence in that region, but also about the way in which the other substantial powers in that region, including India and Japan, react to China, which partly depends on what China does and how its behavior unfolds. All of that is extremely uncertain. It's very hard to put any kind of concrete prediction on it, but you can certainly say that those two places are going to be the main ones where there's going to be rivalry over who's got access and who's going to be denied access, and how big anybody's sphere is in comparison with anybody else's sphere. There may also be a little bit of this still going on in the Middle East, but I think the Middle East probably gets less interesting as oil becomes less crucial. So there is a traditional agenda still around here, but it's of a fairly modest sort. It's not about who's going to run the world or take over the world. So this is the traditional agenda of security against, where you've got other state rivals. On the other side of this, you've got an emerging agenda of security with, common security, if you like that term, which is about shared fates. And shared fates, it seems to me, are things that are rising in importance in the world. Climate change is an obvious one of these. We're all in the same boat in terms of sea level rise and the impacts of climate change. We're all in the same boat as regards global diseases and the possibility that pandemics will spread around the system. We are all in the same boat regarding what might be called defense of the planet, whether you are worried about space rocks or not, or worried about supervolcanoes and other kinds of things that could cause catastrophic damage. We're all in the same boat about that, and whatever measures need to be taken collectively. To a certain extent, we are all in the same boat with the global economy as well. One of the interesting things about this emerging world order is that all of the great powers, and I put a question mark by Russia on this one, but all of the great powers are now capitalist. Right? They are not the same kind of capitalism. China has its own very distinctive form of capitalism. So there's an emerging world of varieties of capitalism, but capitalism won the Cold War. Right? Democracy didn't, liberalism didn't, but capitalism did. And that's quite an important feature because capitalist powers need to maintain, at the very least, the global trading system and a sufficient amount of financial order to make that system work. Otherwise, they are all in trouble. So that is also a shared fate amongst them. These things, it seems to me, point towards functional cooperation of a fairly important kind, where one would expect there to be, just as there has been, for example, with climate change, you'd expect there to be discrete negotiations over cooperation on these kinds of functional issues. So that's the second main branch or agenda of security, which is the common security issues. And they, I think, will be equally important, possibly even more important, with the traditional ones. The third branch of this is where these two things get mixed, where you've got elements of shared fate, but also elements of security against. And here I'm thinking of things like cybersecurity, the proliferation of nuclear weapons, terrorism, the concern about artificial intelligence and where it's going and what it might do, and concerns about migration. These are all shared fate issues in one sense, but they are also issues that can be, in a sense, weaponized. And one country can try to turn these against another. There was a lot of speculation over the last years that Russia, for example, was trying to foment migration out of the Middle East into Europe in order to destabilize it. Doesn't matter whether that was true or not. Well, it does matter, but for the purposes of my argument, it doesn't matter. It's a good illustration of the idea of how something like migration, which might be thought of as a shared fate, can also be weaponized. And of course, nuclear proliferation and all of these other things also work in that way. So that presents a kind of third security agenda where these dynamics, the common security dynamics and the traditional security against dynamics blend in complicated ways and have to be worked out. Okay, my time is up. So I hope I've given you a picture of a world that is quite different from the one we've been in, which is unfolding into new patterns which we need to understand, and which will have quite a distinctive set of security dynamics, which will in many ways be different from those we're used to. I don't know whether this is good news or bad news for your line of business. There are still certainly things to be done, but it seems to me that the traditional security agenda is going to be more localized and less global than it has been in the world that we've been used to living in. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to explore more on this in the Q&A later on. Thank you.